Welcome to GreyNoise University. I'm Michael Sargovakian, and this module is a part of our GreyNoise API and CLI training series. In this module, we will be covering IP similarity endpoints and reviewing examples. The IP similarity endpoints are used to provide a list of IP addresses that have matched against the similarity machine learning algorithm to the IP submitted. The IP similarity endpoints have three options. 1. A lookup endpoint that returns all similar IPs based on provided criteria. 2. An export endpoint that performs the same function as the lookup endpoint but returns the output in a file. And 3. A comparison endpoint that allows for two IPs to be compared for similarity. When using the IP similarity lookup endpoint, the IP address is appended to the end of the API URL, which makes it easy to use. This endpoint uses a GET request. For usage monitoring, this endpoint consumes one search each time it is used. This endpoint will return a status code of 200, meaning the request was successful and the IP was found in the noise dataset, a 400, meaning there was an error in the request, such as an invalid IP being sent to the endpoint, a 401, meaning the API key provided was not valid, a 404, meaning the IP was not in the noise dataset, or a 429 if the daily rate limit was reached. For this endpoint, the only input required is the IP you wish to query. If we enter a sample IP on the reference page and click the Try It button, we can review the endpoint response. There are two additional optional parameters that can be used to limit the response provided: minimum underscore score and limit. The minimum underscore score parameter specifies the minimum similarity score to return matches on. For example, if a value of 0.90 is provided, the only IPs that have a score of 0.90 or 90% or higher will be returned. Currently, valid values are between 0.75 and 1.0. The limit parameter limits the total number of matching IPs that are returned. For example, if the query would return 30 matching IPs, but the limit provided is 10, only the first 10 IPs will be returned. Let's run this same request in a command line interface by copying the curl command from the API docs and pasting it into our terminal. I'm also going to be using a tool called JQ to help make the output easier to read. In the response, you can see an IP and similar underscores IPs object are returned, in addition to a total number of matching IPs returned. The IP section provides the information around the submitted IP, and the similar underscore IPs section includes a summary of the match criteria for each IP that was found to be similar. Each entry in the similar underscore IP section includes basic information from the IP context endpoint along with the match score and which features within the algorithm are a match. The documentation page will provide you with the full example of the similar IPs response. Let's look at the similarity export endpoint next. This endpoint is very similar in the data that is returned in the similarity lookup endpoint, but provides the results as an exported file. This endpoint uses the exact same required and optional endpoints as the daily endpoint and also uses the same set of response codes, but also requires that the format of the exported file be provided. Valid options are CSV or JSON. Let's run this request in a command line interface by copying the curl command from the API docs and pasting it into our terminal. As a note, because the command returns a compressed file, we have to instruct curl to output the response to a file and decompress it. You can see that the file was created. Let's take a quick look inside. Looking at the contents, we can see it contains a row for each of the similar IPs included by the endpoint. Finally, let's look at the similarity comparison endpoint. This endpoint is used to compare two IPs to see what, if anything, they have in common based on our similarity tool. When using the IP similarity compare endpoint, the IP address is appended to the end of the API URL. but the comparison IP address is provided as a parameter. This endpoint uses a post request. For usage monitoring, this endpoint consumes one search each time it is used. This endpoint will return a status code of 200, meaning the request was successful and the API was found in the noise dataset, a 400, meaning there was an error in the request, such as an invalid IP being sent to the endpoint, a 401, meaning the API key provided was not valid, a 404, meaning the IP was not in the noise dataset, or 429 if the daily rate limit was reached. For this endpoint, the first IP address is appended to the URL, and the second IP address is provided as a body param named, quote, IP. Let's run this request in a command line interface by copying the curl command from the API docs and pasting it into our terminal. Again, I'm going to be using a tool called JQ to help make the output easier to read. In the response, you will see it is the same as the IP Similarity lookup endpoint, except the response is only the compared IPs. If there is no comparison data, the endpoint will provide that as a response. This concludes this training module. If you have any questions on the topics covered, please reach out to support@greynoise.io.